Sean Vaughn down the sideline. Nice move, twisting Hartsfield around and into the end zone for the touchdown.
Wilson, somehow escapes. He's going to run for it. Plenty of green grass. Wilson stays in bounds. He's still going, and he's in. Touchdown.
On the fly, Boyd, foot race. That is 6. Leaping into the end zone. 68-yard strike.
Berrios shot out of a cannon. It's a foot race to the 20. Berrios is in. 103 yards for the Jets.
Mills, he's looking deep down the field again. He's got a man and a touchdown. Chris Conley pointing out blockers. There goes Brandon Powell. Punter to beat into the end zone. Touchdown.
Welcome in, everyone, to the Lucky Shots podcast. Today, it's another episode of the Fantasy Show. We're going to do the Fantasy Show first. We may have a guest tomorrow, so we're going to do the Fantasy Show today so that him and I can talk about playoffs and stuff tomorrow for the Game Day show. But Fantasy semifinals, how'd they treat everybody? They treated me well. I got the win, won by about 40 points. Dallas's defense absolutely killed it for me. So going into the finals, now I've got some questions. Who do I put in instead of who? And I'm sure some of you also have those same questions. So we'll look at who was good last week. We're going to look at who I think some of the top guys are going to be for your championship matchup, and who some guys are that maybe you should stay away from. Maybe look for a different option. And if you have other options on your team, possibly go that way with it. So let's start out with the Fantasy Kings. Absolutely huge performance for quarterback Joe Burrow. He had 38.1 fantasy points, 525 yards passing, 4 passing touchdowns, and 11 rushing yards. Almost had 5 touchdowns. I think one of them got called back. But 525 yards, that's a huge number, especially coming out of a second-year quarterback. At the running back position, there was no Austin Eckler. Remember last week I said I think Austin Eckler is going to have a really good week in that Houston matchup. Well, he was out with COVID, so his replacement was Justin Jackson, and look at that. He was the best running back last week. Had 34.2 fantasy points, 64 yards on the ground, 2 rushing scores, and 8 catches for 98 yards. Even though the Chargers got their asses handed to them by Houston. I'll go into a little more of something I saw about upsets this year tomorrow on the show. The wide receiver position, well, if Joe Burrow has a big game, somebody else has to have a big game on his offense. That guy was T. Higgins this week. Led all fantasy scorers with 43.4 fantasy points. Had 13 targets, 12 catches for 194 yards and 2 touchdowns. And then at the tight end position, Mark Andrews. He's been a staple of the top 5 for however many weeks these past few weeks. 10 targets, 8 catches, 125 yards and a touchdown, racking up 26.5 fantasy points. On to the top quarterbacks, rounding out those top 5 guys. Yeah, Dak Prescott had 31.5 fantasy points, 330 yards passing, 4 touchdowns, and 21 rushing yards. What's impressive about that is I don't believe he played the whole game. I think they pulled all their starters out at the end of the third quarter. Just an absolutely dominating performance for the Cowboys, who are starting to look a little more competitive and kind of making things interesting. Then you had Josh Allen go off for 30.96 fantasy points. He had 314 yards through the air, 3 passing touchdowns, and 64 rushing yards. Zach Wilson, guess what? Not the first time he's been in the top 5. Second time. He had 23.18 fantasy points, had 102 passing yards and a passing touchdown, but also 91 yards on the ground and a touchdown as well. And then Patrick Mahomes rounds out that top 5. He had 22.32 fantasy points. Real simple for him. 258 passing yards, 3 touchdowns. Simple, easy, got the job done. To round out your top 5 running backs, Joe Mixon. The entire Bengals offense had a great day. Mixon had 31.5 fantasy points, 65 rushing yards, a touchdown on the ground, 6 catches for 70 yards, and a touchdown through the air. Speaking of the giant blowout between Houston and the Chargers, the running back on the other side of that matchup was Rex Burkhead. He had 28.9 fantasy points, and again, pretty simple for him. 149 yards on the ground, 2 touchdowns, and 2 catches. Damien Harris in that 4th spot had a huge game, 28.3 points. He had 103 yards on the ground, but 3 rushing touchdowns. The Patriots did not lose because of him. He put in all the effort he could, and just wasn't enough to get the job done for the game. But if you had him in your fantasy lineup last week, what a hell of a performance, and you were very happy with it. Rounding out the top 5 is Nick Chubb. He had 27.4 fantasy points, 126 on the ground with a touchdown, and 3 catches for 58 yards. Luckily, my matchup didn't come down to being real close because he was on my bench. Then the top wide receivers from the past week, you had Devontae Adams in the 2 spot. He had 33.4 fantasy points, 13 targets, 10 catches, 114 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Guess who's back? A.J. Brown. He had a huge game, 31.5 fantasy points, 16 targets, only turned it into 11 receptions for 145 yards and a touchdown. So what a game for him. And this Titans offense, I'm telling you, they're going to start looking good again because A.J. Brown is catching a stride. If they get into the playoffs, possibly getting Derrick Henry back, this could be a scary team down the stretch. Then in the 4 spot, a Buffalo wide receiver. Not Gabriel Davis. We saw him, a week ago? Not Stephon Diggs, who you would normally think. Not even Emmanuel Sanders. It was Isaiah McKenzie this week. He had 24.9 fantasy points, 12 targets, 11 receptions, 125 yards, and a touchdown. And then rounding out the top 5, another guy who's pretty much a staple inside the top 5 for any position, it's Debo Samuel. He had 28.1 fantasy points, finally started getting back involved through the air, had 11 targets for 9 catches and 159 yards, 32 rushing yards, but did not record a touchdown. So imagine how massive his game could have been had he scored a touchdown. The fact he got in the top 5 without scoring was also just a great performance from him. At the tight end position, you had Dalton Schultz at that 2 spot, 22.2 fantasy points. He had 9 targets, 8 receptions, 82 yards, and a touchdown. In that 3 spot, you had Gerald Everett. He had 16.8 fantasy points, 5 targets, 4 catches, 68 yards, and a touchdown. Kyle Pitts, he's coming on strong as well. He had 16.2 fantasy points. On 6 catches on 6 targets for 102 yards. And then Zach Ertz only had 13.4, but had a hell of a target share. 13 targets, but it only turned into 8 catches for 54 yards. So imagine if he scores. Imagine if, he at least averages 10 yards per catch. Would have been an even bigger game for him, and could have helped people a little bit more as well. Now let's move on to who's going to be those championship performers, who are going to go out, help you win this championship this week. It's obviously very important. You've worked all year to get to this point. Now you don't want to put a dud into your lineup and lose because somebody skunks or somebody has a bad game. So, the top 3 quarterbacks, I think, going into this next week, you're going to have Tom Brady. He's going up against the Jets, who are 27th against quarterbacks. Tom Brady up in the top, I believe, 5 this year in fantasy quarterbacks. So that's a great matchup for one of the better fantasy quarterbacks of this year. Tom should get the job done for you. The number 2 guy, Josh Allen. He's going up against Atlanta, who's 24th against quarterbacks. So again, another great matchup. Josh Allen, another guy. He's actually the top scoring quarterback so far this season in fantasy. So go with him. He's going to be the guy that can put you over the edge. And going up against Atlanta, he's not going to have a ton of resistance. So he could easily get the job done for you this week as well. And then Aaron Rodgers going up against Minnesota, who's 29th against the quarterback position. He had 33.5 against them in week 11. So again, great matchup. We've already seen him have a great output one week against this team. Now, going into a game where Minnesota needs to win to stay alive, Green Bay is going to obviously want to knock out their division rival so that they're not in the playoffs. And I think Aaron Rodgers puts up another big game. At the running back position, a guy who really took off last year and won people fantasy playoffs, I think he does it again this year. David Montgomery going up against the Giants, who are 25th against the quarterback position, or the running back position, sorry. But David Montgomery, had a pretty big game last week, had a decent game the week before, starting to build up, and now it's the fantasy championship. I think he may have some sort of fantasy football sense that people might be counting on him, and he's going to put out big numbers this week, I think, especially against a weak Giants team. Damien Harris, he's had a pretty decent year all year. Finally got into the top 5 last week. 3 touchdowns. Heck, you'd take 1. You'd take even 2. So, he's going up against Jacksonville, who's 14th against running backs. This is the identity of the team now. They got to run the ball, and Damien Harris is the workhorse. So, I think he's going to have a good output for you as well. And then the guy who probably got you here, if you had him, Jonathan Taylor. He's going up against Vegas, who's next to last against fantasy running backs, and Jonathan Taylor, he's the top running back scorer of the year. You're obviously going to play him, but I think he could have a matchup changing performance this week. Then at the wide receiver position, who had a really big impact last week? Well, he finished 3rd in the wide receiver rankings. A.J. Brown going up against Miami, who's 25th against the wide receiver position. And sure, Miami, they're on a roll. They've got a lot going for them, and their defense is doing pretty all right. Had a really good game against the Saints. Granted, it was against the 4th-string quarterback Saints, a really banged-up Saints team, a team that didn't have a lot of players because of COVID. So, but they've won, I think, 7 in a row now. So it looks like it could be a tough matchup. But after A.J. Brown's week last week, you got to think they're going to go to him again, and he could have another 15 to 16 target game. And that's just going to give you plenty of output for that wide receiver position. Then Debo Samuel, a staple of the top 5. If you have a guy on your roster that's inside the top 5, that's obviously going to help you. Could give you a big edge, if you need it. And he's a guy that could pick up slack for the rest of the team. He's got a lot of different ways he gets involved, and he's going up against Houston, who's 15th against wide receivers. Yes, Houston's coming off the big win against the Chargers, but this is a letdown game against a team that is also fighting to stay in the playoffs. So I don't see any let up for Debo, and I think he's going to be a really big key contributor this coming week. And then the final wide receiver, Antonio Brown, going up against the Jets. Again, all the injuries and things like that that are plaguing that locker room in Tampa Bay, going up against the Jets. Not a great passing team. They are 8th against wide receivers, but you got Tom Brady. They're going to have to put extra attention on Gronk as well. So that's going to open up AB, and I think AB has a really big week this week as well. At the wide receiver position, Mark Andrews, got to throw him out there. Doesn't matter that he's playing the Rams. They're 14th against tight ends, and I don't know how many weeks now in the past, 8 to 10 that Mark Andrews has been inside the top 5. So, again, he's a guy that if you have somebody in the top 5 of a position, it's really going to give you a boost when you need it. Then Dallas Goddard. He's going up against Washington, who is 18th against the tight end position. And he scored 20.5 points against Washington in Week 15. What's to say he can't do that again? Sure, he kind of had a slow week last week, but it's a game that the Eagles have to win. They are fighting to get in the playoffs, and he has got to be one of their main targets because he's a big guy, and, it worked the first time they played them. So expect Goddard to have big things this week as well. And then George Kittle going up against Houston, who's 25th against the tight end position. So, he's another guy that since he's kind of gotten back and gotten on a roll, he's making things happen. And against Houston, they're not very good, obviously. They've won 3-4 games. Kittle, I think he has a big game as well. The caveat with Debo and George Kittle is going to be Trey Lance this week more than likely. Jimmy G has something screwed up in his throwing shoulder. Maybe he's just making excuses for all of the absolutely terrible throws he had last week in their loss to the Colts. But nonetheless, it could just be Trey Lance. Does that hurt them? Does that help them? We're going to have to see. But you can't bet on, somebody else's talent when you got to just try to base it off of what their talent is. And you got to expect Trey Lance is going to be able to get them the football. We saw him during the preseason do pretty well at it. Saw him, a couple games this regular season do some things. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Those two, they're just freak athletes, great fantasy players. So now, who are players that could possibly kill you this week and ruin all the hard work that you put in to get into the fantasy playoffs? Well, I think Kyler Murray going up against Dallas, who's 13th against quarterbacks, could be one of those guys. It's been a rough few weeks for the Cardinals. It's not getting any easier having to go up against a Dallas defense who just tore up Washington. They're really good, and they get a lot of turnovers, mostly interceptions. So if Kyler throws 2-3 picks, that could absolutely kill your week. Even though he was the top quarterback last week, I think Joe Burrow going up against Kansas City, who's 22nd against fantasy quarterbacks, could be kind of a bit of a trap. Kansas City is on absolute fire. Looking now, they're 2 games away from winning 10 in a row to go into the playoffs, sitting at 8 wins in a row. The Bengals, they had a good week last week, but they're very inconsistent going up against a Chiefs team that's fighting for the 1 seed. It's not going to be easy. I think Burrow's going to get a lot of pressure in his face, and it's just not going to work out well for him. He could make mistakes, and again, if he scores under 15, you're going to have a very, very long hill to climb to get back into that championship competition. And then the final quarterback, I'm going with Kirk Cousins going up against Green Bay. Green Bay is 30th against quarterbacks, so it looks like a good matchup. He did have 25.24 against Green Bay in Week 11, but he's had less than 20 points in his last 3 games. Less than 20 points is going to make it very difficult for you to get things going. So if you got Kirk Cousins in your lineup, hopefully you can go do something different and maybe make a switch. I know that this morning I saw Taysom Hill kind of sitting on the fantasy waiver wire. Guys like Trey Lance, I think those may be better options than Kirk Cousins this week. At the running back position, Saquon Barkley going up against Chicago, who's 13th against the running back position. And Saquon just hasn't been Saquon all year. Even last year wasn't because he got hurt. So, I mean, we haven't seen a very good Saquon Barkley game in a long time going up against a stout Chicago rushing defense in a game where, it doesn't really mean much of anything for either team to win. I don't see a lot coming out of Saquon this week, and you might as well try to plug somebody else in. Saquon, I don't think, is the guy. At the running back position, this one kind of hurts me a little bit. Cordarrelle Patterson going up against Buffalo, who's 21st against fantasy running backs, but just watching the game this past week, they're not utilizing him like they did early in the season, which is, it's disheartening and it's hard to see. I mean, I saw Mike Davis getting passes, getting targets. Why? Why are we switching up the formula that worked earlier in the year for Cordarrelle Patterson? It's just not going well. It's a game against Buffalo where Buffalo could, possibly give them a lot of problems where they could be passing. And if they're not going to pass to Cordarrelle Patterson, you're missing out on a lot of points. I know I'm benching Patterson this week, so that's how serious I think this game is, and how much I don't think he's going to have a good game. Then to wrap up the running backs, you have Antonio Gibson going up against Philly. Yes, Philly's 22nd against running backs, so that should be a good matchup. And he had 18.5 against Philly in Week 15, but in 2 of his last 3 games, less than 15 points. So he had, 18 against Philly between those 2 weeks, but less than 15 outside of the Philadelphia game. I mean, if he didn't get into the end zone last week, it would have been less than 10. So not a good week. It's just, I don't know. I am going to start him because I think he's got a better shot than Cordarrelle Patterson this week to make something happen. Washington's coming in. They're still barely in the playoff hunt. And if they can beat the Eagles, that helps their chances. So they're going to come out and they're going to play hard. And one of their best players is Antonio Gibson. So there's a possibility he could do just fine, but I don't see it this week. Then at the wide receiver position, Keenan Allen against Denver. Denver's 10th against the wide receiver. He scored 15.5 against Denver in Week 12, but only 7.5 last week. This Denver defense is pretty dang good against the pass, let's be honest. They get a little bit of pressure on the quarterback, and then their secondary is just, it's really good. And I'm not sure who exactly will be covering Keenan the whole game, but regardless, 1 through 3 at the cornerback position, I think they can bottle him up pretty well. And after last week's debauchery against the Texans, the Chargers might be staggering a bit. And let's not forget, the Broncos won that game the last time that they played. So it could get kind of interesting, kind of dicey. So Keenan Allen could, be involved. It's kind of like Antonio Gibson. But I don't know. It worries me. Then CeeDee Lamb going up against Arizona. Arizona's 27th against the receiver position, but CeeDee Lamb just has not been really that game changer, that league winner the past few weeks, or really at any point in the season. He had 1 week where he, I believe, was the top wide receiver, but other than that, it's been rather mediocre. And if you've got a guy that has a chance of being more than mediocre, you got to take it this week. And guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown, there's a possibility that I play St. Brown over Keenan Allen this week with Justin Herbert as my quarterback. So if you've got guys that have the chance of breaking out and having some sort of game like that, you got to put them over somebody like CeeDee Lamb going up against Arizona, who's got a pretty decent defense, and Lamb's been underperforming. So I just think this week is a week you might have to move on from him. And then to finish off the wide receivers, Terry McLaurin against Philly. Philly is 2nd against the receiver position. He only had 7.1 against them in Week 15, and for 5 weeks in a row, he hasn't even broke double digits for fantasy points. I don't know what happened to Scary Terry, but he has absolutely dropped off. You want to know what happened? He played me in a league and kicked my ass, and then that was all. That was it. That was the end of it. So this week, I think he's another guy you got to move on from. Don't get stuck on the names. you got to go with what your gut tells you and what could win you this week, because this week it's for all the marbles. Then at the tight end position, Mike Gosicki going up against Tennessee, who is 5th against the tight end position. Gosicki wasn't very involved on Monday night. He had a few catches here and there. But again, Tennessee, they're kind of creeping back into being, hey, this team might be pretty good. And Gosicki, I just don't see him being super involved. I see a lot of Jalen Waddle. I see a lot of the running game. But Gosicki, there's, again, a chance he does it. But I see the offense going in a different direction than him, especially when Tennessee can shut down tight ends pretty well. Then you have C.J. Uzomah. I think Burrow's going to have a tough game. Uzomah, I know he's not normally a top fantasy tight end option, but he has had some big games this year. And maybe you think he's going to capitalize like Burrow off of that huge game last week that Burrow had. I don't see that happening. Kansas City, again, is 22nd against the tight end, but I think Kansas City comes out and plays really good defense. I think it's a letdown week for the Bengals, which we've seen quite a few times. Even though they're fighting to stay inside the wild card spots, Uzomah is definitely very low tier this week for tight ends. And then to finish off, Kyle Pitts going up against Buffalo. Buffalo is 3rd against the tight end position, which means they pretty much lock down everybody and anybody. Pitts had a decent week last week, number 4 tight end, but only 16 points, six targets. That was it. He had 1 big catch. That's why he had even remotely close to a top 5 finish. If he does something like Ertz did, he's not, he's sitting bottom of the top 10, which it's not kind of that hard to get inside the top 10 of a top 5 that only had 13 points. So I think this is another week where you may think you rely on Pitts, but you should go a different way. Somebody like Dalton Schultz. Schultz is another guy I think could have a pretty decent week. So, again, don't get stuck on names in this final week. I'm trying to do the same. Like I said, I may start Keenan Allen over, or I may start Amon-Ra St. Brown over Keenan Allen this week. And if I take a small look here at what my lineup looks like, other guys that I'm thinking of possibly playing, like I said, Dalton Schultz, but I do have Dallas Goddard. So it's just, you got to put in who you think gives you the best chance of having that big game, because you need the possibility of the big game. Don't chase consistency this week. Chase the win. Chase the championship. And you may find yourself holding up the crown at the end of the year. But that is it for this week's fantasy show. Should actually be the final fantasy show before we do the fantasy awards of the year. That may be next week. May put it off a week after so that I can get everything put together, make it all pretty and nice looking. But don't forget to join tomorrow. We will have the game day show. We'll go over all the playoff scenarios, all the who's sitting where in the playoff hunt, and possible predictions of where we think teams are going to finish and how the playoffs are going to go and who may be your Super Bowl champion. And then don't forget to join on Friday. We'll have Dylan Corbett in as well. But that's it for today's show. Good luck. Go get them. Bring home some championships. Let me know down below in the comments, or let me know on Twitter if you brought home the championship this week. But I am Ricky Larson. This is the Lucky Shots Podcast. We'll see you tomorrow.